Good evening and welcome to the PoliticIt podcast. Tonight we have Kim Coleman from Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn. And Kim is a former legislator and has been working on podcasts for a number of years. Thanks for coming in.
You bet. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so let's talk about you just a little bit. I'd like people to get to know you.
Okay.
So tell people about your background, because it's actually interesting, the number of things that you've done.
This time that we're in sort of the parent movement, I was one of the OG parents to be kind of blacklisted in a school. That led to us forming a charter school, one of the earlier charter schools, Monticello Academy. We've now built a couple of Monticello schools, but we pioneered financing for capital assets, which is now sort of the commonplace. So we couldn't just start a charter school. We also had to pioneer how we build our buildings and sort of get out of the business of third-party leasing that was common at the time. So I think that's sort of a space where I'm looking back almost 20 years when we were feeling the pain in our regular public school, and my husband and I really went to work to create something different. So I have a lot of sympathy, empathy for some parent concerns right now. We saw a lot of these things almost 20 years ago. So I love seeing it. I love seeing the next generation of parents kind of, rolling up their sleeves and pushing back and doing what's best for their children. That ended up kind of placing us really squarely in a policy realm, which ended up leading to me serving in the Utah legislature. So
that was kind of the impetus for that, right?
A little bit of detours and paths eventually got us there. But frequently when people ask me, how did you get involved in politics? I don't know. So I look back at really what was the first thing, and one of the earliest memories I really have is being a young mother, having my firstborn starting to toddle around the house, and notice across the street we had a drug dealer, and it was all the telltale signs. It was the frequent cars spending 1 minute leaning into a window, something happening. So I started recording and taking pictures, taking logs of what was happening on my street, then going to Salt Lake City and saying, okay, now do something. It's clearly a drug dealer. And Salt Lake at the time said, form a neighborhood watch. So I got my neighbors together and I said, let's have a meeting in your backyard, and you bring the cookies and I'll do the invitations, and we'll get this together. So I went and knocked on my drug dealer's door and handed him an invitation. And he said, what is this? And I said, well, we're going to have a little meeting and we're going to talk about your illegal activity and how we get rid of you, but you're welcome to come. And he actually came and knew we were serious. All the neighbors had gotten together. I had just completed a degree at the University of Utah with a minor in criminology. So I actually was certified in criminology. And I knew that criminality generally takes the path of least resistance, and I was going to be his resistance. So he ended up moving about 2 days later, and I think that sort of encapsulates a little bit of who Kim Coleman
when
is.
tell me a little bit about that meeting. It's interesting that he showed up.
Yeah, so he showed up. So it was in a neighbor's backyard. We were just on a short sort of dead-end street, so it was just a handful of families, and I just remember him leaning up against a detached garage, arms folded, and listening and knowing we were serious. Your home is typically your biggest investment, and we had sunk everything into this home, and I'm going to be raising my little family here at least for a while, and you don't get to come mess that up. You don't get to put my family at risk, my property at risk. You don't get to do that. Go find another place to do it. So we became the resistance, and he was gone. So he was renting the place then. He was renting the place. Yeah. So I think that sort of just encapsulates a little bit about who I am. I tend to notice, and I tend to want to do something when I notice. I can't
notice and
what
act,
I see.
Right?
Exactly. So, after that, we moved into another neighborhood across town, and we weren't there long before we had an attempted child abduction. And I heard about that at the end of the day, and I wondered, why did I hear it at the end of the day? doesn't everybody do a neighborhood watch like we had just done? And so I found myself forming my second neighborhood watch that led to the city asking me to train other neighborhood watches and help other families organize their neighborhoods. That led to an invitation to serve as a planning commission, where really that was kind of my first time inside of government,
Right.
and seeing things you can't unsee, recognizing really sort of what's going on. Planning and zoning is where, decisions are made, everything from what your signage can be like for your business, or what you can build and where you can build it. This is really a strong intersection of property rights.
Right.
And kind of cut my teeth there. I don't know that I would vote the same way that I did early in
Right.
that, but learned a lot there. My husband tells the story that I came home one day and said, "Oh, the city's a mess and it's going the wrong direction. One of us needs to run for city council." And I just had a baby. So, yes, dear.
So he did it.
His was my first campaign, really, that I managed. And from there, I had other city council candidates contact me about managing and consulting on their campaigns. So that was sort of my first foray into the campaign side, campaigns and elections side. And then again, in this new neighborhood, but a terrible school and a school going in the wrong direction. Always good people, but sometimes it's just not serving the needs of the community or your family. So we kind of went to work, rolled up our sleeves, and tried to be very engaged in that school community and for the better, and found a lot of resistance, and thought, okay, we need a better choice. So my husband also tells the story about how one day he came home and I said, honey, I have a solution to all of our education struggles. We'll just build our own school. And he says, Kim, you can't just build a school. It doesn't work that way. You can't just go build a school. No, you can. They're called charter schools. And so we built one of the earlier charter schools. So we've been operating 17 years almost, 2006, 2007.
I didn't realize you still had that charter school. Yeah.
So yeah, we're still governors, or governing board members of the charter school, and I built a second one. Like I said, pioneered capital financing, which was always a struggle for charter schools early in the movement of charter schools. So, we, to a large degree, my children avoided a lot of the painful aspects that some families are dealing with now, but my kids ended up going to the local public high schools, where we now know the problems in our public high school.
Right.
Most notably, last year, our principal and vice principals stopped the Turning Point USA High School Club. That was a valid club, had been pre-approved, was doing everything they're allowed to do, but because they were pro-capitalist and pro-America, they were told to take those things down and shut down their club. And the students fought for that, and to have their club. And then they were told they could have their club as long as they removed USA from their title, because that's the offensive part. So we're still dealing with that principle in our community and that mindset. So I'm still.
So this was a recent thing.
Oh, this is now. So
this is now.
Was last year that the principal shut down this club, gave an absolutely highly concerning lecture to these students about how they don't have free speech rights on a campus, and that it's that the school has the right to decide what speech is allowed in the school. And these were amazing students. You should have them on sometime to talk with them. Amazing students that knew their rights. They knew their First Amendment rights, and they pushed back, and the principal simply was wrong. And these students, I really, kudos to their parents, kudos to the people in their lives that taught them their First Amendment rights, and that they were strong enough to stand up to an authority figure that really has a lot of impact in that high school. But they stood their ground, and they were absolutely right. And not much has changed.
Yeah. Well, my best memory, well, there's several of them, but with you to start with, it was your your push in the legislature to put free speech on college campuses.
Yes.
And it's amazing to me. I mean, just tell people a little bit about that. It's amazing to me the resistance that you got.
Oh, it's unbelievable in our public government institutions of education, and where for decades I think we've assumed that college campuses have been the bastion of free exchange of ideas and free speech. And I remember going to a national conference of legislators and learning about how speech was being restricted on some college campuses. And I remember sitting in this workshop saying, well, I'm glad that hasn't come to Utah yet. And the next slide in the presentation was that Dixie State College had made the top 10 worst. And I thought, wow, okay, I can't sit by and do nothing. I've got to organize. I've got to work in this space. And so I did. I ran free speech legislation. It was model legislation that was run in multiple states, passed before it passed in Utah, which goes.
That was the thing that came out of FIRE, right?
That came out of the Foundation for Individuals, Individual Rights and Education. Yeah. So fantastic organization. They're nonpartisan, bipartisan. They're all about First Amendment rights on college campuses. So I wrote the model legislation, and we really struggled to get it passed in Utah. Yeah. I am excited to say we did get some pieces, some aspects of it passed.
Well, now didn't Jordan Tusher, did he replace you?
Yeah.
Okay. And he finally did get that bill passed.
He got it passed, but all the teeth were removed.
Oh, yeah.
So I feel like, well, we really could have passed it at any number of the years that we ran it, as if there were no penalties for higher education.
Right.
But
yeah.
It was important for us to make sure that if the governmental institution violates your rights, there should be a remedy.
Right.
And that's an absolutely codified.
So what was that remedy that got cut out then?
So we looked at federal, what's called 1983 laws that say if the government violates your rights under the 1983 section of federal code, then there can be penalties that represent damages that you've experienced, as well as a key piece of this is that your lawyer fees are paid then by the defense if the court finds that the government did violate your rights. What's so important about that is because we recognize in America, because this is different from where we came from in England,
right?
Where England has generally, at least historically, had a policy of the winner sort of takes all, and the loser pays all the lawyer fees. Well, we recognize in America that the government really is out of balance with the regular citizen. The government really does have a disproportionate power, and up to and including their own attorneys that are full-time employed by whatever governmental entity, up to and including our state attorney general. So this is very, very powerful resources on the government side. So our courts have decided, our Congress decided a long time ago, we're going to try to balance that out a little bit more, make sure that a citizen who's been violated can appeal to the courts and not have the risk of being in debt, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. For one of these 1983 cases, the average I think is somewhere around $300,000. That means the average citizen can't access the courts to appeal for their rights, which is the very first thing in the First Amendment. Is you have a right to appeal, you have a right to seek redress, you have a right to free speech. But if you can't get there, if you can't even go to the court because it's so overwhelmingly expensive, difficult, time intensive. So what we looked at in our campus free speech at the state level was mirroring what happens in a federal violation. And it made sense, and the courts have upheld it for a long time. If you are the big government and you harm a citizen by violating their rights, you get to pay their lawyer fees and you get to pay some damages. So while when Representative Tusher did pass the final piece, we passed pieces. For
Right.
instance, I think this is key. The college campuses had restricted free speech zones to some little 2x2 square foot behind the dumpster way at the end corner
Right.
of campus. And so that wasn't a real effective free speech zone. So we were able to pass that, say, no, the whole college campus is a free speech area. So we did pass pieces, but the final piece was sort of that individual violation of your free speech.
Right. And then the redress that.
And the redress. So it did remove the redress. It did remove really any penalties against the institution, but it did at least create in statute the definitions for recognizing what your rights really are on the campus. And so that was really a big piece of that. I hope you come back later if we need to, and put penalties in there if we need it.
I think that I'm glad for that explanation, because it's insightful for me. Before I was even in the political space, right? I've always been interested, but one of the memories I have that's really interesting was you had been working on that legislation. I knew those things were important to you. And I remember calling you on the phone and say, hey, we had just gotten $25 million from Charles Koch. And, for what is now at Utah State, the Center for Growth and Opportunity. But it was interesting because the Faculty Senate had passed a resolution that said that they should control that budget because they were afraid of the harm to the institution by having a Koch center on campus, right? And I remember calling you and saying, hey, how would you like to come to a Faculty Senate meeting? Do you remember that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember that Faculty Senate meeting and how an agenda that was posted and a packed room all of a sudden got very truncated, and a decision to kind of move on from that particular agenda item.
Well, didn't I think when you came in, you actually sat by the president.
Yes,
right?
I did. Yes, I did.
And that conversation was like, well, why are you
What
here?
are you doing here? I mean, what are you doing here? Well, I don't know. I at the time I was sitting on the Higher Education Appropriations Committee, which is the committee that decides how much money these institutions get. And so I had, multifaceted interest in being in that.
And she knew that, right?
Oh, she knew that. Absolutely. Absolutely. She knew that. And yet all the money that flows into these institutions through private funding, public funding, but this is the one that all of a sudden they want to restrict. And so I thought, okay, now I like this guy. I like this John guy because he's also willing to poke.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting is when they did skip that item on the agenda, but the next Faculty Senate meeting, it was supposed to be brought back up, but it was tabled permanently.
Gee.
And it never and never came back again. And it's interesting how sometimes just being there matters, right? When you have a reputation for actually protecting people's speech rights, that's an academic freedom issue, right? But just being there sometimes can change the way people look at that.
And to your point, not even just a legislator. I mean, this is the thing I would want any citizen to know, to show up. And sometimes, if it's the drug dealer on the corner, or if it's the school who doesn't believe in your children, if it's, that free speech is being restricted on the college campus, sometimes citizens don't know what they can do and they don't feel empowered. And I would say, show up. You can really shift a dynamic of a school board meeting or your city council meeting by being on that front row or middle row,
right.
Showing up.
Right.
And then people know you're watching, you're paying attention. So just show up.
What happens a lot of times in those situations, though, is people show up and then their first action is to put the city council or the school board on the defensive.
Yeah.
Right. And whereas when you walked into that meeting, you weren't in anybody's face. You just sat at the right place.
Hi, I'm
right.
Here.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. And the message actually was pretty clear, right? I mean, it was figured out that that potentially is probably why you were there,
Right.
right? That one issue. So,
Well, and I think that's sort of the indictment of a policy too, is when there are eyeballs on it and there's a retreat from that policy, that it probably tells you a lot what you
yeah,
need to know
right.
about that policy.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, let's take a break and we'll come right back.
What are you listening to? Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn.
Welcome back to the PoliticIt podcast. Of course, Kim Coleman is with us today, and you know, one of the things as we were talking during the break, I thought let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
What am I doing now? People are always asking me, are you going to run for something again? I'm having a lot of fun working behind the scenes and helping really good people affect good policy. One of the things I've done is there were some disappointments in 22 in Utah races, legislative races. We flipped some seats. We had some really good successes and we had some disappointments. Disappointments in our some of the races for the state school board, things like that.
Yeah.
It really didn't go the way Republicans, conservative Republicans wanted to go. So
But the fact of the matter is, though, we have a 1-vote majority.
Yes,
with people that are conservative, right?
Exactly. So we definitely have some better places, but we had some nail biting and moments, and so I have kind of rehung my shingle in the political consulting, campaigns and elections world, which is kind of where I started way back 2001 or so.
So did you work on some of those school board races then?
I didn't. No.
Okay.
No, and I really didn't work on any races in 22, but that was also what motivated me to, okay, I've got to get back in this business. We really need more capacity in conservative campaigns and elections in Utah. But I'm also serving as a senior policy advisor to Councilman Sheldon Stewart. He's a Salt Lake County councilman, where we also just enjoy a one-person majority in Salt Lake County. So very interesting perspective to have worked in government at a city level, at the state level. I ran for Congress a couple years ago, so paid a lot of attention to the federal level, and now being in the county. And I knew I was going into Salt Lake County. I knew this was going to be kind of crazy government. I knew it was going to be less than ideal. I knew that it was going to just structurally and politically kind of mess with my worldview of how things should really go. But I had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought I knew how bad it would be. And then I went there, and it is it's crazy. I think and always when if I talk about government problems and the structure of it, there's always good people and there's always nice people, but sometimes we institutionalize bad ways of doing things or ineffective ways of doing things, and sometimes not all the people have the best of motives behind what they want to do in our government. But I would say pay a little bit more attention to county government and local government. So I think sometimes we look at all of our political battlefronts and where do you even start? And we're definitely concerned about the federal government. We're always concerned. I mean, politically, policy-wise, this week we've seen very, very impactful things happening at the federal government. We're watching Title 42 expire and seeing what's happening on our border.
Yeah, did you see today? The judge just stayed that 800. I think I read 800,000 people at the border right now.
It's just
waiting for this title
for the title to expire, and then we've got the $33 trillion debt that we're also looking at. So we definitely. We're rightly concerned about the federal government. We're rightly concerned when we get back to our state level where you're serving, where I served, and policies that can be so impactful. But I am here to tell you that the Trojan horses are in county government, at least, our Democrat-run county governments. So for all the good you do, we should have a lot of conversation about what goes on in the county. And,
right.
To give you an example, one of the first votes that that Councilman Stewart had was something concerning a George Soros grant that had been accepted and had been appropriated and budgeted, and they were the mayor wanted to make an adjustment, and my first thought is, we take George Soros grants? Okay, I have a lot to learn here, what we do in this county. More recently, I know a mutual friend of ours, Tawny McKay, city councilwoman from Riverton. The county is considering imposing or allowing a new fee to be imposed on hotels, a new assessment. It looks a lot like a tax, feels like a tax, quacks like a tax. Could be a
tax.
A tax, but we call it a fee because I guess that lets some people feel better and sleep at night. But I guess technically it's a little bit of a difference between a fee and a tax. But this would allow something like $8 million a year to go to a nonprofit in the county that does some of our does our tourism work. Well, Tawny McKay discovers that this nonprofit tourism organization kind of went and had a side gig where called Social Offset. So look at my Facebook page and the clip from Tawny confronting Visit Salt Lake on this social offset. It's not stealth anymore, Senator. It's not code words. It's black and white, actually purple and white on their website, that if you disagree, you want to come to a state, but you disagree with their legislature and the policies that have been implemented in this, we'll help you offset that. So social offset. So it's social issues. It's or that tend to be social issues.
It's the same DEI.
It's the same thing. So you've got some DEI. You've got those in Councilwoman McKay's meeting. They cited specifically the pro-life and abortion positions that Utah's taken. So if you don't like that, you disagree with that, doesn't align with your values, those states' values as evident in their policies, if you don't like those, come to the state and we'll help you kind of poke at that in the state. We'll help you offset. We'll help you take your money, your tourism dollars, and put it to things like Planned Parenthood.
Right.
And so when you look at the county and we do things like this and we prop up organizations that really work against the community values, and that's
the thing, is the prop up part of it, right?
Yeah.
Using state, city, and county resources to prop up things that are clearly in opposition to the laws in the state.
Right, and they will tell you that they use private money because, I think Salt Lake County, or the public money, is about 2/3, if I have this right. And they will generate other revenues, advertising, membership dues, things like that. So they'll say, oh, they're using private money to do those things. My question is, should 2/3 of their budget be propping them up and legitimizing them to go do those kinds of efforts? Right. And, should we be in that business? And I think the more I get to see under the hood of Salt Lake County, the more questions I have. And I work to explore these policies and advise Councilman Stewart on some of these policies. But I think the legislature should have ongoing discussions with some of our county folks about what happens when it leaves you,
right,
when your policy leaves you, or your funding, when you adjourn, then what happens? So
yeah, and that actually bothers me. We have problems in our schools, especially in our universities, with outright efforts to undermine the values of the majority of the students that are there, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't help people that are disadvantaged. What I'm saying is we shouldn't, we don't need to brainwash kids. Right. They need to have a strong academic environment where free speech is protected, where academic freedom is protected, and but using state resources for a political agenda is abhorrent, I think.
Well, what's hilarious to me is in that same hearing with Councilwoman McKay, uh, this organization was clear to say, but we are not political. we're a nonprofit. We're not political, and yet that whole initiative was on social political topics.
Yeah.
And
Well, somehow we've given a pass to the woke agenda. It's not treated like a religion that it is, right? If you talk about separation of church and state, that meets every definition of a religious movement, right? And we got to do something. That's why we need people like you.
Well, thank you, and we need people like you. So we definitely need people all over the place, I think, that are willing to just show up and speak up. And one of the most tragic things about the time that we live in is the number of people that tell me they're afraid to speak up. And because they can have real consequences.
That's when we have a really dangerous situation, right?
Right. And we're there.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really there. So
yeah, it actually, when I think about it, it reminds me of Mao's Red Guard, right? I mean, and I hope people wake up and realize that.
I hope so too. And they've already accomplished so much just by people fearing speaking out. So we definitely can point to people who have been punished for expressing our common points of view. Definitely. Right. We've seen it on college campuses. So we've seen students be expelled, be punished, suspended.
Well, and I think in Utah too, if you look at the general population, we like to be nice.
But you went there first.
Right? I mean that's true. We like to be nice. It's important for us. But is it nice? It's nice to appreciate people for who they are, allow them to be who they are, but we don't need to adopt their political ideology to be nice to them.
No, and if you really look at what that political ideology seeks to do, there's no space for me and you.
Right.
There's no space for our way of thinking. There's no space for faith, for traditional faith. There's no space for conservative ideals. There's no space for restraining the government. There's really not a space for us. So when my neighbors and my associates that aren't particularly political, when they say they're afraid to speak up, they really are. They're afraid of their job. They're afraid of social shunning. They're afraid of economic impacts and all of these things that we're really there. It's not any longer, what can this lead to if we don't stop it? I mean, we've already muzzled America, good deal of America.
Right.
That they live in a fear of saying the truth. And
well, I see that on university campuses,
right.
Big time.
Right.
Well, we're out of time. I would love to have another discussion about that though, because I think it's the topic of our time.
Definitely.
And it's something that we really have to, slow down at least, right? Yeah. Put a stop to. Well, thanks, Kim. Any closing thoughts you have?
Just thanks for your good work up there in the Senate, and you're doing good things, and you were one of the early people to speak out, and you were not afraid to go against the university, and that's fantastic because that's rare. That's rare. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.